Welcome to COVID-19 Business Watch. It's apparent that key government ministers still believe this pandemic will be short-lived and result in something of a return to normal, a V-shaped recovery. Trade, Industry and Competition Tsar Ebrahim Patel's comments to MPs on Friday that economists are sucking their thumbs to make projections about the economic damage of the lockdown was at best ineloquent, as lots of modelling is being done, commissioned by the Treasury and the financial sector. Granted, modelling through uncertainty is like a blind man looking for a black cat in a dark room at the moment. But even more concerning was what he said according to the report of the Trade, Industry and Competition Portfolio meeting. It was in an article carried in the Sunday Times. He certainly believes that a V-shaped recovery is on the cards. Now, I've yet to meet any economist worth their salt who truly believes that a V-shaped recovery is what we're encountering. So are we asking the right questions about the nature of our economic recovery? That's what a recent paper released by the Centre for Development and Enterprise tries to interrogate, and we're going to try and do the same on the panel today. Let's welcome our panellists. Ann Bernstein, Executive Director at the CDE. We've got economist Duma Gqubule and founder of KIO Advisory Services, and Annabel Bishop, Investec Chief Economist. Thanks for joining us. And kick us off, Donald Rumsfeld said that there are known knowns. There are things we know that we know. There are known unknowns. That is to say, there are things that we know we don't know. But there are also unknown unknowns. And I think there are things we don't know in a crisis such as this. And it's making decision-making extremely difficult around the virus. In your paper, you try and draw from past history to make some forecasts and dialing it back to the global financial crisis. How should we be thinking about the future path out of where we find ourselves now, economically speaking?
Well, Michael, I agree that there are very many unknowns, and it would be good if more people in power acknowledge the unknowns of the current situation. We don't make any projections or predictions of what's going to happen, but what we do know is that the world economy and South Africa's economy is being devastated by the pandemic and the lockdown and the reaction to the pandemic, and how we think about recovery, unlocking the economy, getting our economies up and firing is absolutely critical. Now, South Africa entered this situation in a very weak position, much weaker than many other countries, and that makes our recovery and thinking about the recovery even more important. I don't know many international economists who are talking about a V-shaped recovery, and certainly not in South Africa. But recovery is a word we need to interrogate. Are we just saying recovery back to our less than 1% growth of 2019? That's devastating for South Africa. So we entered this in a very weak position. And unless we have the right attitude to economic growth, to the fiscal crisis and what needs to be done, and we're thinking about serious economic reforms and implementing them, South Africa is going to be in years and years, if not decades, of serious trouble. So getting onto a new trajectory is vitally important, and the nature of our recovery, which starts with how we unlock the economy, is absolutely vital. And it has to be what's in the national interest, not what happens to be in a particular party's interest. We've got to be thinking about half our population and now more who live in poverty, and an increase in our world-beating unemployment rate before COVID, and now even higher. How do we deal with this? How do we get as many firms up and running and new firms going as soon as possible?
And I think with that entry point, it's quite clear that factional politics has come to the surface again. Despite the President's letter to the contrary yesterday morning, it does look like many decisions are still being taken driven by a particular political factional interest and not necessarily the national interest here. Annabel, looking at your scenarios, and I say scenarios because modelling is so difficult in this environment, what are your scenarios now? I think we spoke about 3 weeks ago in terms of gross domestic product decline for this year. We've had various projections ranging from around 4% 4% negative to around 10% negative. We've had a bit of an extended lockdown by 2 weeks and then going into lockdown light effectively now. What impact is that going to have on the economy in 2020?
Yes, hi, Michael. Look, I think, the key point really to start off with is that none of us really know, and it's really unpredictable what's going to happen globally and indeed domestically, partly because we haven't seen the pandemic peak globally. We don't know when COVID-19 will exactly run its course throughout the world. And of course, particularly in Africa and South Africa as well, we are still quite far away from seeing the pandemic peak. And the lockdown that we're in, we've moved from level 5 to level 4, sure, but the lockdown that we're in, the movement to opening up the economy further, to dropping to lower levels, which then imply stronger and faster economic growth theoretically, because more companies are allowed to open and operate, will again be wholly dependent on the path of the pandemic in South Africa. And I think our ministers have been quite clear, telling us that they can dial it back. They can put us back into level 5 if they need to, not just because of non-compliance with the regulations they put out, but also, of course, as well, in terms of what else happens with the health situation. And I think, the point you make is quite important. Scenario work does give us some sense of what could happen. And you could say if the lockdown, were to extend through the second quarter and move into the third quarter, what would that look like? And you can put a number of variables into it. But again, it is still very, very difficult to tell. And of course, added to that is the large stimulus package, which National Treasury has recently said is bigger than any other developing economy in the G20. That large stimulus package totaling 500 billion, certainly from a fiscal support measurement perspective, but moving to 800 billion when you add in the monetary policy effects, which we can talk about as well. That then also will provide some countervailing balance. And quite interesting in that National Treasury study was that they said it's going to be your higher income people that suffer the most, as your lower income people continue to receive the social welfare grant. So again, so very many factors to put into a situation that I don't think anyone can give you a clear forecast of what's going to happen. If someone gets it right this year, it's probably mostly going to be luck. But certainly, we've got around about a 5% contraction on the basis that we continue to see this lockdown easing. And, we've got almost an equally weighted probability that we don't see, a continued and, probably increasing in rapidity easing in the levels, moving down back to, level 3, 2, and then obviously into 1. But the big issue is, once we get there, what is going to be supportive going forwards? Globally, we face a risk of financial turmoil, even a financial crisis, if global liquidity measures, if monetary policy stimulus is withdrawn too quickly. And of course, there is also the concern that many countries are ramping up their debt levels quite substantially, certainly for countries that already have large quantums of debt, and South Africa falls into that category. Again, there's a risk there as well. So perhaps moving into some other scenarios where we think that there's quite a strong chance of further credit rating downgrades for South Africa this year, mainly because the credit rating agencies say that will happen because we're on negative outlooks. That in turn then will worsen our economic growth prospects. It pushes up our borrowing costs. And most importantly of all, I think we need to realize that the good yields that we are seeing now, the low yields for our benchmark 10-year government bond, our longer-term interest rates, and of course the low interest rates from a repo rate perspective in the short term, these are temporary measures. They're not going to persist. And we did not see a strong recovery from the global recession in 2008, 2009. In fact, we never really recovered to the strong growth rates we experienced before that. And at some point, we will have to wind back both the monetary stimulus and, of course, as well, the fiscal support that's come through. Obviously, the Reserve Bank buying bonds to push these yields low. All of these factors at some point will need to be wound back, perhaps not this year, but certainly over the next few years. The Reserve Bank said its bond buying is not limitless, and it's not going to be indefinite. And, if we don't put in these structural reforms, which Anne, started off talking about, which we can expand on throughout this chat, we're going to find ourselves in a very dire situation, possibly worse.
Absolutely. Annabel, on that point of how do we pivot to a faster growth trajectory, I think that is the key. It's echoed in the CDE paper. It was mentioned in the Treasury paper, this 3-phase approach. We had to stabilize, which was the lockdown. It's now the path and recovery out of lockdown. And then from there in phase 3, it is pivoting to faster growth. To Anne's point, we can't go back to the old normal of growing at well below population growth rates. And I suppose, Duma, the question to you is how do we do that given the base that's been provided by Treasury? I know before the announcement of the 500 billion rand program, you were quite critical of Treasury being slow out of the blocks, a little bit like Rip Van Winkle here sleeping. We've come out now, we've put the big guns on the table. Has Treasury gone far enough to provide a foundation from which we can pivot to faster growth?
First thing I would like to say, Michael, is that I was reading an article recently in the Financial Times to try and understand what's happening with stock markets, which have recovered recently in the last month or so. And they were saying that the stock market has concluded that there'll be a V-shaped recovery. But anyway, I don't think anyone outside of stock markets believes that there'll be a V-shaped recovery. And I was reading the IMF World Economic Outlook, and the chief economist was saying that the most difficult thing about this outbreak is that we just don't know how long it's going to last for. There are nightmare scenarios where we only peak in September, and who knows how long it will last. So the problem is that most of the decisions are in the public health sphere, which many of us have no understanding of. Then you have to make forecasts on the economic side. In terms of unpacking the stimulus, I saw the presentation from Treasury, and I'm still going through the numbers. But the key issue is that I think there's a lot of we have to analyze it, obviously. So they say it's $1 trillion rands, which is absolute nonsense. So they say it's 500 billion rands on the monetary policy side and 500 billion rands on the fiscal policy side. Now, if you unpack that, about 700 billion rands comes from certain incentives for banks to lend. So we have to look at the quality of this. How on earth are the banks going to lend 700 billion rands when so much, when individual balance sheets are stressed and when company balance sheets are stressed? And I just don't see it happening. And quite frankly, I think it's too good to be true on that one side. The second side, on the fiscal policy side, you have to look at how much is on the budget, how much is off the budget, below the line and above the line. If you look at below the line, that is the 200 billion credit guarantee and the 60 billion from the UIF. So above the line is about 240 billion rand. And when you minus the reprioritization and you minus the tax deferrals, which shouldn't really be part of the stimulus, I come to a figure of about 50 billion rand is the proper stimulus, the net contribution by Treasury. So my biggest disappointment with what's happened in Treasury is that the trend globally in terms of stimulus packets is that you've got to go early. As I was listening to someone else at another workshop, you go early, well, we didn't go early, then you have to go hard, then you have to go consumption. Now, we are not giving enough in terms of supporting consumption spending. And the 50 billion rand is welcome, but it is clearly totally inadequate. And also on terms of the UIF, the 40 billion rand, it's now 60 billion rands from the UIF. The UIF will probably have to extend its TERS benefits beyond 3 months, so we could see them unwind the majority of its surplus.
We're talking about the country's path out of lockdown and how we can pivot to a faster rate of growth. Ann Bernstein, when we left off, Duma was just critiquing the measures, the rescue package that is on the table. I think a lot of it is underpinned by cuts that we'll probably see in the budget or reallocations come June, July is what I'm hearing. We might see that budget brought forward. But I really want to focus on the third point of Treasury's plan, and that is how we pivot to faster growth. We're in phase 2, and by all accounts, the restrictions and the regulations now are not seemingly making a lot of congruent sense. We look at the banning of unfettered e-commerce, for example. We look at the foregone revenue by still continuing to ban the sale of tobacco products and driving those revenues into the hands of the illicit traders. And I think a lot of the buy-in is creating a lot of frustration amongst business. Surely there's got to be a better way at easing the restrictions and then building on that to pivot to faster growth?
Well, very important question. CDE is actually having a webinar on this very topic, different perspectives on the lockdown on Friday. My view, increasingly, in a very difficult situation where you have to balance the health situation and the number of cases with the economy and the cost to lives on both sides, not just on the health side, but if we go into a real depression, people's lives will be affected, and there are many people on the brink of survival in our country. So I think how we deal with all of this is going to be really important. And I am inclined to a much more bottom-up sort of view. We could have had regulations that said these things are not allowed and everything else is, and you've got to prove that you can create a safe environment. So I think that debate is going to hot up, and this is a critical period for the government because, if you like, the social contract between citizens and the state and the trust that we've given to government in these extraordinary powers that the Disaster Management Act gives the President and the Cabinet is starting to fray. So I think we're at a critical time. We've got to understand how weak South Africa is. We can argue about what you should or shouldn't do, but the weakness of this society in terms of our fiscal crisis, our stagnant economic growth before going into this pandemic, and the devastation this pandemic is kind of causing on our supply chains internally, on small businesses, on survival businesses. I think we're seeing the linkages in South Africa, not as strong as we would like, but the linkages between, if you like, big business, medium-sized business, and small and informal business, that money circulates around and that you've got to understand those interconnections in a way that is not often being clear from certain cabinet ministers. So I think the key of all of this is that South Africa has to reform, and we have to think afresh about some of the elements of that because of the changes that COVID-19 has brought globally and in the country, but that we cannot return to business as usual. And that in a way, what one wants is that the president, who has, I think, really led the country very well, can use that popular support for him before it dissipates to start the country on a new road to economic growth, which will require bold action. And, you know, the key of all of this, and that's, if you look at what happened after the global financial crisis, from which South Africa did not recover in terms of growth, we saw a 60% collapse in average annual growth rates in South Africa, which did not have to happen. So this is a global phenomenon, but how countries do will depend very much on how we manage this interplay in this particular country between the health dynamics and keeping people as safe as we can and the economic dynamics. And it's who's the team. So you have the Command Council and perhaps the more security sort of securocrat type of people in charge of things. When are we going to move to give more power to the National Treasury and the people who really understand how a complex modern economy works, and to think about how to unlock and to learn by doing? There isn't a playbook, but we've got to by doing in the right direction.
Well, one is concerned on that point, and that politically, certainly from what came out in Parliament last week, Treasury looks to be on the back foot. The finance minister shrugging his shoulders, wringing his hands, saying we lost the debate around the fiscal or the revenue loss that we're seeing as a result of the ban on the sale of tobacco products and the continued ban on the sale of alcohol that's delivered to your home, and whether or not that is a trade-off worth making. So to hear that the Treasury and the SARS Commission on the back foot there does bring into question the political dynamics and interplay at cabinet level. Annabel, I want to come back to an important point that you raised, the impact being disproportionate on the middle to higher income earners in South Africa means that we are placing a heavy burden on our tax base, and we run the very real risk. I speak to small businesses daily. I field emails and calls from small business owners who say they don't have runway. They can't afford another month of lockdown. And if they do, they're going to have to close their doors. They're going to have to retrench people. And that is a real structural erosion of our tax base. What is your concern here around the lockdown approach that we've taken going into lockdown level 5 effectively into lockdown level 4, which is lockdown light? And what would you like to see done differently?
Look, I certainly think that the impact is probably going to be worse than the fiscus is imagining, than National Treasury is imagining on government finances. And of course, you were talking about small businesses and, you know, the anecdotal evidence to you about how they feel about the extension of the lockdown, whether it's restriction level 4 or 3 or whatever. And I think, you know, what's quite key, if you actually look at hard statistics, a survey done by Statistics South Africa recently indicates that, you know, 40% or more businesses feel they're going to have to close their doors and retrench people if this persists much longer. And of course, the longer it persists, that more than that number will increase by. You know, people are utilizing their savings, businesses are utilizing their savings, and we're in an environment where corporate and household balance sheets are weakening substantially. We are not ever going to recoup this loss of economic activity, of gross domestic production, of incomes, ever. We're not going to recoup it in this period. Sure, we may see the economy recover eventually, we may see growth lift, but what we have lost now is not going to be recovered globally or domestically. And the same goes for government tax revenues, and the same in turn goes for the impact on government finances. And the reality of the situation is, yes, there are a lot of things that could be done better. There could be a lot of areas they could look at where they can actually raise tax revenue, certainly, but more importantly, where we can widen and broaden economic growth without spiking up the health risks. And you were talking about e-commerce earlier. We were talking about a number of other areas. Certainly, you know, your intense social situations like the tourism industry, like personal care, hairdressers, those are going to take a long time to reopen. But there are many, many, many areas that can reopen more and quicker. And of course, the reality of the situation is that I think we are shooting ourselves in the foot by not allowing a lot more online retailing, by not opening it up extensively. Yes, there's the concerns that the people who work at the retail industries and the delivery will have some exposure. But the reality of the situation is we can't continue like this until September, because looking at all the health experts, they're saying incidence is probably only going to peak in September. What are we going to do? Wait until the end of the year before it's peaked and come down? It's not ever going to peak either if we don't start to open up the economy. And the reality of the situation is, and I think maybe this is part of the answer to your question, many other economies globally have taken different approaches. I think we need to stop being so inward looking and nasal gazing in South Africa. I think we need to look outwards and see how have other countries globally handled the crisis, yes, but how have they also handled their economies, the lockdowns, and what are they doing to actually put themselves on a strong footing to recover quicker. We're certainly not going to see any type of V-shaped recovery if we're going to see this very slow, which is, I would say, a problem, given that there are so many forecasts built on it from National Treasury to other institutions as well.
I've just got to stop you there as we're running out of time. Duma, there was a fund manager survey by Bank of America Merrill Lynch released last week, where the fund managers in South Africa, 29 of them surveyed, they said, do you feel strongly or somewhat disagree with the statement that the president is now in a stronger position politically to run through the economic reforms, to push them through? And the majority of the fund managers surveyed believe that the president is politically stronger and we'll see a ramping up of economic reforms. Do you share that view?
Well, Michael, we had Ramaphoria 1.0. It lasted for about 3 months until April of that year, 2018, when the currency tanked. And we're now in Ramaphoria 2.0. You know, the longer this, you were saying at the beginning that the support is fraying, but the longer government was quite frankly irresponsible to shut down the economy without having a plan as to how to replace the incomes of the households and firms that are affected. I was reading yesterday in Business Day that the UK announced its stimulus 3 days before the lockdown. So I do think that right now things are fraying in society, and I just think I'm not sure how long this Ramaphoria 2.0 is going to last, because the government, in my view, this thing could continue for a whole year. And I don't even want to talk about the pivot to the next stage, because we've got to get this current period the year that we're going into now, we've got to get it right and provide what is called disaster relief. We have to address the humanitarian crisis. I'm actually shocked about the situation with access to food. We saw that queue of people queuing for 3 kilometers, 4 kilometers in Olifantsfontein, and they're searching for food. One would have thought that the easiest thing to sort out, that you shouldn't make budget deficit calculations when it comes to providing people with food. And I would have thought that's one of the easier things. And now we're seeing about the quality of the food that the people are getting. Why can't you give them a cash voucher for them to spend it as they see fit? So I really think we have to focus on the current situation before we even talk about, and because we're getting it wrong in many respects, before we even talk about pivoting and structural reforms for the recovery phase.
Point well made, Duma. And not only that, around food, we've got a government that now wants to completely centralise all the efforts in the NGO sector that the charities are doing, and philanthropies and foundations, to try and distribute food as well. Complete madness. That was Duma Gqubule, economist and director of KIO Advisory, Ann Bernstein, executive director at the Centre for Development and Enterprise, and Annabel Bishop, chief economist at Investec. U, L or V, I think without reforms, the letters to describe the economy are going to be R, I and P. Goodbye.